when I thought about doing this, I'm not gonna lie, I was a big chicken. I wasn't gonna ask Tony, Tracy, and Dan to do this because I was just a big chicken. I guess I was afraid they were gonna say no. And within moments of asking, they replied, yes, what can I do to help? Because that is their character. They are amazing humans who know that this craft is incredibly important to all of us. And I think that finishing this year strong musically has been a source of great pride for me. So, and I hope it is for my singers as well. Our communication net has grown tremendously. Basically, all the things that we put out that are virtual now, they have over 1,000 views, which is bigger than any performance venue we have on campus. That's, 3 sold out shows in the Nelly plus maybe a 4th. So I think that has been incredibly exciting. And I'm so proud of the work that we did. And so I thought it was super important that I not be a chicken and ask them if they could come and talk to us and tell us how their creative processes work. Because I do believe in these constrained times, we're not gonna go back to what we were. Everything is different. Our cheese has changed. Our cheese has been moved multiple times. But I also know that in our most constrained times, we have to create. And when we create, we generate hope. And when we have hope, we have everything. So all that being said, I welcome you to this amazing forum. I'm strangely excited and strangely nervous to be sitting in front of this monitor with all of you. So right now, Tony, would you like to start? And also, I know that Dan will be joining us in about 15 minutes or so, and I had a great joke, and Mikey told me it wasn't funny, so I won't say it. Dan will be joining us, and I also realized that people will be coming in and coming out. So hopefully they understand that they'll all see the mute buttons, and we'll move on from there. So Tony, without further ado, would you like to give us a little background?
Yeah, I think maybe maybe Tracy should jump in here too. I think because the idea, if we're talking about Over Havet, the idea really started with Tracy's vision. You talk about his kind of power. Tracy thinks of things and then they happen. I don't know how he does it, but if there's anything in the universe that you want to have manifested, you just let Tracy know about it and it'll happen. So I'm going to actually toss the ball to Tracy to kind of get it started with an idea, like what you first pitched to me, and then I'll kind of pick it up about what my process was.
Well, first of all, you all are way too kind. I just do what I can do, and I'm happy to be a part of it in a small way. It's one of those long family kind of stories that, where people always start, I was born here, and it's not going to start there today. But it goes way back to my childhood. My parents, my father left, my mom, some people are lucky and they get really good parents. I just think parenting is like anything else. You're either really good at it or you're not. And my father wasn't a good parent. I mean, he wasn't about it, and he left. His parents were salt of the earth, farmers from Iowa who were very instrumental and very helpful in my growing up because of the lack of my father's presence. I spent a lot of time on the farm, and so this story started, it was sometime, my father left when I was 1, and he would visit off and on through the years, not frequently, but I was always close to him for some odd reason. He called on holidays, he called on birthdays, he called randomly sometimes throughout the year. We never had a way of getting in touch with him, but he would randomly call at times. He came to visit. I remember it was one of my earliest memories. This is where this all began. And I think he realized that my mom was going to move on, and he he took me aside. He wanted to tell me a story, and it was a story about my great-grandfather, his mother's father. His name was Peter Mandius Nerlin. And all he told me was the story he knew. And I don't know why it was important for him to tell me this at such an early age in my life, and why I remembered it still is an amazing part of the story to me. But he just said, your great-grandfather, my grandfather, came from Norway when he was 16, which would have been in the late 1890s. And all he came here with was 16 cents in his pocket. He came through Ellis Island. He found his way to Iowa. He couldn't speak English. He eventually bought himself a farm. And that's the only part of the story we knew. My great-grandfather, I figured out more as I was there, but my great-grandfather didn't talk about what life was like in Norway because it was probably too emotional. I mean, when he left, he was never going to see those people again. He was never going to have a conversation with them. It was really a wake for them when he left. They had to have a wake because they were never going to see him or hear from him again, and which ended up being true. So this is the premise, and I can come back. I want to come back after Tony speaks, but the way this got started was Dan had just written a premiere that my choir did in New York, and it's called Arise Shine, and it was amazing, and the experience was amazing. And that's a funny story in itself, but Dan, and not knowing Dan lived in Lawrence at the time, when I contacted Dan, I emailed him from Lawrence, Kansas, and he was a student at the University of Kansas, which I didn't know. I was a church choir director for 32 years, and I happened to stumble upon a piece of his, like one of the first he'd ever published, completely fell in love with his writing and what he was trying to say with the content. And so I reached out to Dan in an email and I said, if you have time, could you send me your cell phone number? He didn't know me from Adam. And I would like to talk to you about an opportunity. Well, within 5 minutes, he called me back and he said he would do the premiere for New York. Well, fast forward, it was the summer following. We did that premiere the next January, and it was the following summer. Dan and I were on the phone, just having a conversation. And I just brought up this idea of Over Hava. And Tony is the one that came up with the title. I just told him, I said, hey, my father told me this story, and I kind of told him the background. And I said, I don't know why, Dan, but I've never forgotten it. And I think it would make a great piece. I don't know if you think the story would make a great piece, but I think it would. And I said, do you think, I only knew who Tony Silvestri was. I said, do you think Tony Silvestri would consider writing the text? And he said, yes, let me get Tony on the phone. So I don't know if Tony remembers this, but I didn't know Tony was living in Lawrence at the time. And I was in Lawrence, but it wasn't even that phone conversation that I found out that he was living in Lawrence. It was months after that. But he called, we had a conversation with all of us on the phone, and Tony, the moment I heard his voice, I knew that we were already friends. Like, it's not one of those situations where you meet somebody and you say, I felt like I've known him my whole life. I knew that Tony and I were friends before that conversation, and I can't explain why. I don't know what the magical part of that is, but we were already friends when he picked up the phone, and we spoke very candidly with each other, not knowing each other, and Tony said yes. And then that's how the whole process got started. So I'll let Tony then talk about, and then I can talk about the experience of what transpired after the writing.
This particular commission, and I've written a lot of different texts for a lot of different composers, but this commission specifically spoke to my day job. I'm a professor of history at a small university, and I've been interested in family history for a very long time. And so this particular poem then allowed me to use all of my research skills and my historian skills. So I kind of, for the very first time, put on my historian hat. And I was doing some family history at the time for my own family. And so I had an Ancestry.com membership. And so I plugged Tracy for information, any information he knew about the names of his family members, their dates of birth and death, and so on, just so I would have some, you know, basic building blocks to find this man. And pretty soon, using a little bit of research and a little bit of time and a little bit of ingenuity, I was able to find him and found his immigration record out of Ellis Island, even a photograph of the ship that he had come in on and the registry of that ship. And I found his name as a passenger. And then his processing papers from Ellis Island. I was able to follow him through all of the US censuses. From, I think the 1900 census was the first one that he appeared in. I don't remember exactly, but he was listed as a farm boy or as a servant on someone else's farm at the first time. And then fast forward 10 years, he had his own plot of land. And then fast forward 10 years, there's a wife listed with him and a child. And so I got to see sort of the flourishing of this American dream as it unfolded over time. One of the records that they had was his World War I draft card. And I noted on there that it said that he had gray eyes. And I thought, oh, that's kind of an interesting little tidbit. And I stored that away, and that's going to go into the poem. And so eventually I conceived of this long sort of saga that begins in Norway with a young man wanting to leave, and he looks out over the gray sea and the gray sky and longs to have a different life, a better life. And that's where the idea of having some Norwegian in the piece came as well. I wanted there to be a repeating refrain that was slightly different each time. And so I wrote it in English first, across the sea, and then the different phrases at the end of each verse. And of course, I didn't know any Norwegian, so I tried, Google Translate and all the kind of pathetic things that you do when you don't know a language. Eventually, I found a singer in a choir in Norway who had contacted me months and months before about something else, about one of the other pieces that I had written. And I reached out to that person, Bjorn, I think was his name. And I said, hey, can you help me with a poetry project that I have? I need a couple of lines in Norwegian. And so he helped me translate it. And we had a lot of conversations about how to translate it into a kind of Norwegian that this young man's grandfather or great-grandfather might have spoken in. Not something that is contemporary and fresh, but something that's a little stilted or a little old-fashioned. And so he gave me lots of options, and I chose the ones that I thought would sing best, and that also had that flair for a Norwegian speaker, that they would think that it was something from a different century, from the 19th century or from the 20th century. And that's sort of how it took shape. So there's a verse about his longing to go. There's a verse about his arrival at Ellis Island. There's a verse about his establishment of his own career and his own farm here. And then you fast forward to the very end of his life. Now it's his gray hair instead of his gray eyes, and he looks out across the fields that he's created and into eternity, a sea of eternity. Very often I am asked when I do speak to choirs, what's my favorite thing that I've ever written? And of course, I mean, that's a hard thing to answer. They're all my favorite in one way or another, but Over Havet is one of the pieces that I've created of which I am most proud. It somehow tells it's a true story, but it speaks truth. It's an authentic experience. And, unless your family came here, unless you're Native American, your family came here as an immigrant or as a slave. And we all have an experience like this of our ancestors getting on a ship and coming here. And so whether you're Italian American immigrants from 1900, whether you're Greek American, whether you're Polish, whether you're Norwegian, German, or even Mayflower family, this immigrant experience can speak to you. So it was a very, very powerful thing for me. And then I passed the music or the writing on to Dan. I don't know if he's popped in yet, but that's where my process sort of ended. It was a fun poem to write. Dan and
Sarah?
Matt?
This is Dennis Murray. First of all, let me say those introductions were great, and thank you, Sarah, for including me. I'm going to have to jump off to another WebEx at 4:30, but I just did want to thank you, Sarah, Mike, Laura, I think, Son, for all the great work you've been doing, keeping our music program together. I'll tell all of you, although I'm on campus every day, I miss the students and the activity, and most importantly, the beauty that our music department brings to this campus. So please come back soon. Let me tell you, we need you. You are the best part of Marist College, and you certainly lift our spirits. So, but stick together, spread the word, and I do want to thank these industry professionals that you've been able to get to participate today. What a great experience for our students. And to our seniors, I do want to note how much I've appreciated getting to know you and work with you through the years. I'm heartbroken like all of you. We're not going to be able to celebrate on the campus green next week. But as I said in the letter that I sent to all of you, we have postponed commencement, not canceled it. We will reunite one day together for your graduation, and hopefully also many other alumni events through the year. So thanks to all of you. Sarah, keep up the great work, and I can't wait to see and hear that great voice and the great voices of all the members of our music department again in the future.
Thanks so much for joining, Dennis.
Okay, bye now.
Take care. Bye-bye. Mikey, is Dan on? Not yet. Okay. So I don't know, Tony, do you want to continue chatting about process, or should we just banter?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's been a while since I've spoken to the members of your group, and so maybe there are folks here that haven't heard this, but I often also get asked about my process. It always begins with a long conversation with the composer, or in this case with the commissioner and the composer, so that I get a real strong sense of what this piece is about. Ideally, I want to write a good poem that stands as a poem, but I also need to write something that is singable and settable, and so that has a lot of music infused into it, and that's sometimes more difficult than others. This time it sort of just sort of flowed because I was so inspired by the story and by the skills necessary to do it. But I have this long conversation with the people involved, and I really try to pick their brains about what is it going to sound like, and what kind of emotional journey you want the audience to go on. And so I kind of know how long the piece needs to be, what it needs to be structured like, what kind of emotional language I can use. Very often the composer will be very forthcoming with golden phrases that I can use directly, sometimes word for word, in the finished poem. And so when they get it, inevitably they're like, "Oh, this poem is great. It speaks to exactly what I wanted." And it's like, yeah, you wrote half of it. And in this case, I had Tracy and Dan both having ideas throwing at me about what this piece was supposed to sound like.
Well, I can also, I'm going to just jump in here for a real quick second. Since Tracy and Tony were both with me when I sat with Dennis Murray, we totally tricked him into having his piece written. And just a real quick backstory there, I had no intention of sitting in the room with Tony. I thought it should really be a very private interview. And Dennis told me just to sit down. And I was like, no, I'm going to go. And Tracy then said, Sarah, sit down. Your president just told you to sit down. At which point, Tony asked the perfect questions of Dennis. And he's furiously writing in his notebooks. And, what seemed to be like 5 notebooks later and maybe 25 minutes, he was like, okay, I'm done. I got it all. And then he took his notebooks home and spun some of the most delectable phrases that we all know. We have all sung The Long View. And it truly speaks to his interview with, and I just sat there I didn't say anything.
Having
You know,
those notes, having those interview notes is really only the first step. Tracy, did you start to say something?
yeah, I was going to say, especially before Dan gets on, maybe he's already on, but Tony and I together have collaborated with maybe a dozen different composers, do you think? And what I find interesting is how Tony and I have to adjust differently to every composer. They are so different in their approach and the way they're thinking about it. And like some composers want a lot of text, and if Tony gives some a lot, they'll only use a little, and that's frustrating for Tony. And I also know that like in Over Havet, Tony wanted to use Rav Gule Hava, but Dan didn't want to use it because he didn't think it'd make it sound pretty. Do you remember that? And Tony said, Tracy, if you tell him you want it in there, he'll put it in there. So, so then I have to make the phone calls and go, Dan, I really want Rav Gule Hava in there. I don't know why, I just really do. And then, so it's just a collaboration with, and like with Dan, it's different than it is with Eric Barnum. And with Eric Barnum, it's different than it's with Ola. And with Ola, it's different than it's with Kim Arneson. And with Kim Arneson, it's different than Susan Labar. And our approaches with them, Tony and I are always on the backside talking about it and trying to work differently with each composer and what they need and how much they need. And it's an interesting process when you see it on different levels from different people, I guess is my point.
Tony, I've got a question for you then, Tony. So, with Rav Gula Hava, you wanted it in there. Have there been some of the most beautiful prose that are just, no, I'm not using that? And then what happens to those prose?
Well, it goes in my little file. For every commission, I create a manila folder, and in that folder goes all the notes that I took in the conversation, all of my drafts, my endless sort of lists of words or rhyming words and things like that, all the kind of meat that goes into making the thing, a printed out version of my final text, the sheet music, either a PDF or published octavo contract for the commission. All those things go into the folder, and so I've got those folders, a whole file cabinet of all the commissions, 70 some odd composers I've worked with, a couple of hundred different pieces. I don't know, maybe one day I'll donate them to some archive or something, some Marist College maybe, so that somebody can do their thesis on them. Who knows? But what I was going to say is, once I get this emotional map or whatever, then the hard part really starts. It's just staring at the blank piece of paper. That, I think any creator will agree that that's the hardest part of painting a painting or writing a piece of music or writing a poem or a novel or whatever. It's just staring at the blank paper and waiting for that idea to come. And so I often just sort of toss words around, like toss a ball against the wall and see what sticks and see what comes back. And I'll try little phrases. I'll take some DNA from the conversation that the composer has given me, and maybe there's one phrase that is really, really good, and I'll use it as a refrain, or I'll use it as the first line of the piece, whatever. Trying to get unstuck, and also trying to find what the DNA of the poem is going to be. Very often it's clear what the human truth of the poem is going to be. That's often the easy part. Every poem is going to communicate something of my heart, some observation about humanity or some emotion, or in this case, the story of a person. Like, what am I going to say about that story? Oh, that a person can have a rich life, and it has to do with your family and your life of hard work with and for your family. That's success. At least it was in that particular situation. So what's the human truth? And then how can I craft words to say that human truth in a way that is singable for the singers, with vowel sounds that are the good ones to sing, and easy for the director to create a choral tone, but also that have colorful words that are easily paintable by the composer, and the poem is structured in such a way that it gives the composer exactly what they need when they need it. So right at the golden mean of the poem, that's where the volta occurs. That gives the composer a reason to change keys or to go into the minor mode or to reach the fortissimo climax or the valley, the pianissimo valley of the piece. Those parts of the poem are all built in. The parts of the octavo that will come out of it are all built into the poem. I like to think that I give a composer an underhand softball pitch so that they can just smack it out of the park every time. Rather than have to struggle with the poem that I give them, I want it to just be easily said. And so that to me is the craft that I'm most proud of as a singer, as a composer, to create a poem that is already impregnated with music. And it's there for the composer to find. And it just sets itself. That's my goal. If I can get a composer to say, oh, it was so easy, it just sets itself, then I count that as a win for me. But I will say also, before Dan gets here, that this is another thing that I say to choirs. My intention when I'm writing is that ultimately this piece will be sung. And so when I'm creating a piece, I'm the servant really of the composer. But after the poem is done, then the composer becomes the servant of the poem. And the choir director becomes the servant of the poem. And the singers become the servants of the poem, so that the audience can be transformed and have a transcendent experience. Mm. If you're not going to focus on the text of what you're singing, don't be a choir, be a string orchestra, right? Only a choir can communicate text, and so that needs to be the number one thing that you do as a choir, is study the text, learn the text, embody the text, and then put it to the music, which is the vehicle through which the text is delivered. And then the audience can ultimately be transformed. The music is beautiful and people can be transformed by beautiful music. But when you have poetry and music together, that you get to be a choir. So do that thing that only choirs get to do. So at the beginning of the process, I'm subsumed under everyone else. But then after the poem is created, it shifts and everyone acts in service of the text.
Sarah, I can see that Dan has joined the call now. Would you like to give an introduction?
Sure. Welcome, Dan. I don't see him. Oh, nope, that's not him. Okay. Well, first of all, welcome, Dan. I do want to let you know that we are so honored to have you with us. So honored to have both Tony and Tracy with us as well. It is no secret that I am a huge fan. It's no secret that I'm a huge fan of your just amazing ability to spin a vocal line that, as a singer, there are lines that they just loft. And I think some of my favorite phrases are the ones that I, as a singer, I have to work. I have to use technique in order to get there. So I appreciate that it's not always just peaches and cream, that it's you got to dig in and get it done. So I'm so grateful that you're here, and I'm beyond excited. So welcome.
Thank you. Very kind. And I'm sorry to everybody that I was foolish and double booked and showed up late here. It's completely my fault, but glad I got in here eventually.
No worries at all. Tony, do you want to go back a bit, or Tracy, you want to go back? Tony was just telling us all about how his craft is absolutely effortless, and every word that he ever writes, everybody sets to every single tune, but which of course is not what he said. He said that he has a lot of orphan phrases.
Anyway, I told the story of how I wrote the poem Over Havet, and then I was going to pass it off to you about what you do when you get a poem such as that. Unless Tracy has anything he wants to add before you come on.
No, Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, I wish I were joining this conversation more kind of organically midstream instead of just tacking something on. But, I'm not even sure exactly where to begin. I set over Havet to music. Where have you all been?
Let's start here. Can we start with this? So we found out how Tracy didn't realize that you basically lived in each other's backyards, and that's kind of where your story started. When Tony wrote the word, actually, Tony, did you write the poem in its entirety and then send it to Dan?
Yeah, I think that's how it worked with this one. In all of my collaborations with Dan, I've learned that he prefers to have the poem done. But I usually will write enough that I'm well on my way, and then I will share what I'm doing with the composer just to see, like, is this okay? Do you like where this is headed? And if so, then I'll continue. And if not, then there's still time to fix it. I'm not quite sure. I don't remember how it worked with Over Havet, but I think what I sent you was a more or less completed poem, if I recall.
Yeah, I do like. Go ahead, Tracy. I'm sorry.
No, I was just reassuring. Yeah, because Dan and I got the poem at the same time. It was complete. Yeah.
Yeah, I do like complete poetry. I operate very much on like a art song kind of. I want to see the text and see not just individual things, but the big picture, and then find inspiration from it and set it. Other people work really well on like the songwriter approach, kind of going back and forth and finding things. With that said, though, I always fuss for different words. I think I probably did in this. It's not uncommon for me to come back and say this word just isn't singing for me, or this vowel isn't working, or I throw all kinds of really nitpicky garbage at Tony, and he just rolls with it and works until I'm happy.
You're always identifying the ones that I knew in advance that you were going to flag. So
okay. So for me, inspiration for text can come on so many different levels. It feels like from the micro to the macro, and I don't feel comfortable trying to commit to ideas that I've come up with until I feel like they're going to work on all those levels. So in the case of a poem like this, I can see up front it's lengthy. There's a whole story that needs to be told. This isn't going to be a short piece. I can see the sense of journey in the narrative, and I know that the form of my music overall, however many minutes this is going to be, is going to have to follow that journey. And the music needs to feel like that same, I started here, I looked across the sea, I eventually came across the sea, I settled, there's this new life, and now I'm settling in and looking back at the old land, all that stuff. So I know the music is going to have that sense of journey. And there are lots of ways to do that, but one way or another, we're going to have to feel that musically the same way that Tony wrote it textually. There are also lots of little things. I didn't have a chance to grab a copy before I jumped on here. I really need to go grab one. But there are lots of little individual word painting things about line by line. There's those individual lines that kind of curl over each other. There's masses huddled in the shadow of liberty. The music actually does that. There's this massive sound, and then there's these things like huddled underneath. You can like see it on the page and hear it with your ear. And then of course all those vocalization effects. I wanted a sense of motion coming across the sea. There's a little risk that it comes across sort of like a motorboat or something instead of like a steamer. But I needed something that helped us feel like we were just coming across the top of the water. And so that's my attempt to do that with all that stuff. So yeah, there's just all these different levels of individual words or sections or the big picture of the piece as a whole. And all of that, I just have to try to find a way for whatever I contribute musically to be added to whatever Tony has created textually, such that the whole is more than the sum of the parts. Like we could just have a poetry reading and it would be awesome. Or I could just try to write a piece of music and maybe it would be cool. But if we're going to really succeed at collaborating on a piece of music as poet and composer, I think there has to be something there that's not accounted for. I think, you know, if Tony is contributing 16, a value of 16, and I'm writing music that's worth 16, when you add them together, we need to say, oh, 63? Like, what? How did 16 plus, where did that other stuff come from? You know, I make up different dumb numbers every time I say this silly thing, but you know, there has to be like this extra stuff that we can't account for. And that's the beauty of choral music making, of taking text and music and putting them together in such a way that magic happens, and things that aren't fully explainable, and yet we feel them so keenly and powerfully. It's that stuff we can't explain that makes us want to keep doing this and keep performing and keep writing poetry and writing music and collaborating. And those are the pieces that I think choirs want to sing again instead of one and done. So that's what we're aiming for, even if we don't always equally succeed.
Well put. And I love the process too, especially as much as the composer and I can be together spiritually. Sometimes we can sit together at the piano and sometimes it's over a distance, but when there's a give and take and when ideas are shared back and forth, it's why I welcome the opportunity to tweak the poem, because then I can help be part of the compositional process while that is happening, rather than do my part in a bubble and then I'm done. And then the composer does their part in a bubble, and then you have a piece at the end. I think the extra 30, whatever, however much it is, in your analogy, that comes from that sense of give and take, that sense of communication and collaboration and trust of one another and challenging of one another, which is why I'm a real fan of the collaboration model of creativity. I understand why composers go for the dead guys. It's public domain and you don't have to share royalties with anybody. Living poets cost money, but I think there's a reward at the end for that organic nature of creating a piece from scratch, both text and music. That, I mean, I would hope the composers that I work with share that idea, that sense. But it certainly makes it more fun for me to do it that way.
And if I'm setting a dead guy's poetry, then I do sometimes make alterations and take liberties or whatever, but there's always this wondering sort of fear, like, what if I've really trashed this and done something they wouldn't have liked? And, you know, it's a lot easier with a living poet to just call them up, or in Tony's case, I usually text him long texts and just say, hey, does this work? What about this? I don't like that. And, you know, it's much easier and much more safe because I can actually ask him what he wants or for ideas.
I think as the commissioner of works, and I've had the pleasure of doing several with Tony and Dan, but I think I just want to stay out of it because I don't want to affect what's inspired them to write and to make something that they're trying to express in a beautiful way. I think my favorite moments as I look back over my career, my favorite moments are when Dan and Tony are there and we're together, because then I can really try to say what they're trying to say through the choir. They both give me incredible feedback, like, you know, Tracy, that was too fast. I don't want it that fast. or Tony wants, you know, some text brought out in a different or more emotional way. And I just love those moments because it's not just me coming up with it. It's me trying to reflect what they tried to write in the piece. So I think that's why I like doing this. So I've enjoyed doing it so many times because of the moment that it's finished and then we're all trying to make it live together. And then my job becomes, then I finally get to do something. Once it's done, then I get to try to have the choir sing what they all heard and what inspired them to write the piece. So, and having them there is just, it's just unbelievable. It's rewarding, and it's just so satisfying to know that you're a little bit of part of something that's greater than you. And that's been the best part of my journey, I think, in all of the process that we've done together.
Tell them about Over Havet and your experience with your choir singing that.
So I just opened Staley High School. I taught in Kansas for 20 years, and I left Kansas to come to Missouri to open Staley. And Dan and Tony wrote this piece, and it spoke to those kids because, like my great-grandfather, he was leaving a place he knew to a world he didn't know anything about. So it was perfect for us. It gave us a vehicle to build that foundation of of the choir program at Staley. And then I just thought, wouldn't it be cool? I hadn't thought of this until after we got the piece, but I thought, wouldn't it be cool to take that piece to Norway and sing it? And I had no idea where Peter was from, and I tried to find out where he was from. And as we kept adding to the tour, I reached out to the consulates in New York. They went through baptismal records. To no avail. I couldn't come up with it. And then I just happened to get this really strange phone call from an elderly woman who lived in Florida who had a Norwegian accent. And it was a Sunday afternoon, and I thought she was just a scam caller, until she said, I knew your father. And then she said my father's name. Well, when I talked about my father earlier, I didn't mention that when I was in 6th grade, my stepdad adopted me. So my name changed from Knickerbocker to Resseguie. So if somebody knew that I was related to Ron Knickerbocker somehow, it was unbelievably strange and weird. So I immediately changed my mood and was like, what is going on? Why are you calling me? Well, apparently she had tracked me down through my aunt, my dad's sister, because they were having a family reunion on the island where he was from. He was from an island in the largest fjord just off of Stavanger. And the little island is called Fenøy. And she said, I wanted to invite you. And I said, oh my gosh, well, I'm glad you called. And then I told her what my project was. And she said, well, your Aunt Sandy thought I should call you. So in a month before we left, I found the island that he was from, the church that he was baptized, and all the Netherlands that still live on the island. So out of nowhere, like I don't know where any of that came from. So getting ready to leave, I also thought it would be very powerful to sing the piece in Ellis Island. And I didn't think that'd be a big deal. So I went through Parks and Rec in New York, and I got an email saying, no way this will ever happen. There will never be a choir. I'm not exaggerating. It was almost in caps, all of it. Never there will be a choir sing in Ellis Island. It's a sacred space, but you can sing outside. His name is engraved on the wall outside Ellis Island. And I thought, no, that's just weird. I just know we're supposed to be in there. So over the years, my choir was asked to sing for the governor of Kansas' inauguration, and I got to know Kathleen Sebelius a little bit, and then also Jerry Moran, who's a senator from Kansas. And so I reached out to them, and I sent them the recording of the premiere, and I told them all about this thing. And I said, I don't know why, but I just think we're supposed to be in there. And both of them were very gracious and said, Tracy, Kathleen had just moved to Washington to become head of Obama's insurance project, and Jerry was just becoming a senator. And they both looked at me and said, I don't think we can help you, but don't get your hopes up. And that was the last communication I had from him. So I thought we were probably just going to sing outside by the wall. A week before we left, I got an email from President Obama from the White House, and it stated this: due to your family's close ties to Ellis Island and the fact that this piece speaks for everyone, we're going to allow you this one-time concert So we were the only choir to ever sing in Ellis Island, and probably the only one ever will ever be allowed to. The president had security waiting for us to bring us into the space. So we left knowing that we were going to follow Peter's footsteps from Vinoy to New York, back to the Midwest. So what I didn't have any idea of was that anybody would be at the concert in this little church in Vinoy. Long and short of the story, it was completely packed. This small stave church was over 1,000 years old. And the really cool thing is, I don't know if you guys have ever read or watched movies of people who have had near-death experiences. And they describe what they saw, how they felt, and all of that went on while they were in what they believed was heaven. And so anyway, long and short of the story, everybody in that church was related to me somehow. And I still to this day can't figure out how somebody who'd been gone over 100 years, they even knew who he was, but they could tell me exactly how they were related to him. And it was all because of Over Hava. So we get to the church, we're doing the concert, we get to the moment where we're going to do Over Hava, and I turned to the audience and I explained, this is why we're here. And as soon as the piece started, I felt like I was in this heavenly bubble, that exactly the way it's described when people have these near-death experiences. You can't see them, but you know they're there. I knew Peter was there. I knew my mom was there. I knew my dad was there. I knew everything was okay. I knew where my kids were. I knew that everything was perfect. And as we got through the piece, we got to the end, and I started coming back into the reality where we were, and there was this rush of noise behind me, and I turned around, remembering where I was. And the crowd was on their feet doing the ugly crying, all of them. Long and short of that story, we get done. It's time to leave. They take me to the back of the church. Everybody had to exit out that door, and everybody told me exactly how I was related to him through Peter. But here was the cool thing, and I think about this often. After the kids were on the bus waiting for us to leave, the family was waiting in the narthex of the church, and they asked me to stay. And I really wanted to stay. I wanted to get to know him. I wanted to talk to him more. They were living in the house that Peter was born in, actually. And his father was born in that house, and his father was born in that house. And as far as they knew, that house goes back before the 16th century, people living in that home on that island, the Netherlands. So I really wanted to spend more time with them, but I had this responsibility with the kids. And they understood that. So as we were saying our goodbyes, they looked at me and said, can we ask you something? And I said, yeah, anything. And they looked me square in the eye with tears in their eyes and said, did he find what he was looking for? And I stopped for a second, and then I remembered Tony's words. And I looked at him and said, yeah. He had a wife, a farm, a house, a child. He found the richest blessings a man could ever know. And we all just kind of hugged each other and cried. And I said goodbye, just like Peter did. And so we got on the bus, and then the very next morning we flew to New York. But I didn't know they needed to know. So my dad telling me that story when I'm maybe 4 or 5, me not letting go of it for some reason, I realized at that moment it was because there were people that needed peace. And Dan and Tony and I brought peace to that little island that I didn't know they needed it. That's the most powerful part of it. You are suddenly caught up in something that is so much bigger than you. You had no idea that you could ever be a part of something that was so significant. And so we did, and then we got up the next day, we flew to New York, we got escorted into Ellis Island, And the minute the kids started singing it there, I was transported again to this safe, heavenly, really felt like heaven to me. And also I saw visions of things that happened while we were singing back in the 1800s. And the kids saw it too. We talked about it after. But when I came out of it, I've done that piece a few more times. I've done it with Maris. And I've done it with a couple other choirs, but it's funny. I never go back to that place. But it's powerful, and it is exactly what Sarah was saying earlier about what choral music can do, what it's capable of doing when the right people compose it, and the choirs do the best they can to express what those composers were trying to convey. And that's the secret. That's why we're always on this quest. With every piece of music a choir director hands you, we are on that quest every single time to try to bring peace to the world, even if it's just for 5 minutes, because we change it every little time we do that. And it's powerful, and it's incredible, and it changes people's lives in a heartbeat. Like a century of unrest for several people was all put to rest with that one visit and that one piece, which wouldn't have happened without it. So that's the journey of Over Havet. It started with a story that my dad told me one time when I was a little boy. I then approached Dan probably 40 years later, and then through Dan, approached Tony. And then I find myself in a little church on a tiny island, bringing peace to people and to myself that I didn't know I needed. That's another part of it. Choral music's important. It's important to who we are as people, and it tells stories of our lives and our journeys, and great composers have a great ability, and great poets, to give us the vehicle in order to do that. So I'm forever grateful. And as I'm getting now to the end of my time in this part of my journey, this choral world that I've loved so much, I'm so grateful that I have those things and those moments to always carry forward. It's bringing joy to people. It's Jubilate Deo. It's, oh, be joyful unto the Lord. Give thanks and praise. And that's what we do as choral musicians. That's our quest, I believe. But I'm grateful for this opportunity, Sarah. Thank you very much.
You're making me cry. We've been so blessed, at least I have, just by having the expertise of you all, that has inspired me to push them, has inspired me to say a lot of words that you guys said. You know, like I think I say often, you know, what's the difference between us and the band, other than we have a lot more fun? The difference is we have words that have to be communicated, and words, I am a stickler for that diction. I am, because the word is important, and it's through the word that we actually invite our audiences to put down the burden. We invite them to, you know, for if it's a half hour, if it's an hour, we invite them to put down your burden so that we can pick it up. We're here for you. And I tell them a lot that, I tell my choirs a lot that you have no idea what the people out there have been going through. They may not know that they needed this. They may not know why that one phrase, that one lyric broke something off of them, and it can just stay there and they don't have to pick it up again. That's our job as choral musicians, that we are heavy lifters. And you got to train, and you got to pick the right literature in which to do that. There's plenty of fluff that we do because some audiences really like fluff. And sometimes fluff is fun. But I think that we do so many works that just sing in your soul, and you know it. And when we really digest those works as a choir, we chomp them, we chew them, we taste them, we swallow them, and it feeds us. It gives us an energy that we then spin out to an audience, that hopefully they realize that all the colors of this entire choir, right? Because I would also think too that of course they do, certain works sound differently in different choirs, of course they do. But I always talk to my students as if I liken them to threads in our beautiful tapestry, and every single color and every single thread is important. It's part of our picture. I wonder too, if there are times where you hear a work of yours sung by a different choir and you go, wow, what an interesting tone, or what an interesting way to spin those phrases. So I think that anytime we do a work, I don't want it, if we're repeating music, I don't want it to always sound the same. It can't, because the threads change. It always becomes part of our greater tapestry. So that's actually a wonder of mine. Dan and Tony and Tracy, actually, I would imagine your reaction to it too is that for every year there's a different tone. You talk about finding the sound of the choir, the voice of the choir, and after rehearsing for it, generally if we're in large festival situations, you get maybe 2 or 3 hours into those rehearsals and you say, that's the voice of the choir. You finally got there. But when you have these works that are so important, as far as I'm concerned, as choral literature, do you ever hear choirs that you think, oh, that's interesting? Like, anybody? Dan?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in. I hear lots of choirs perform my music, and like you say, they're all different. There's a balance for the composer, I think, between saying, this is the exact way I want this sung, and saying, I enjoy all these different interpretations that I get to hear, and they each maybe say something a little different that I can appreciate. So for me, there's kind of maybe if you were to diagram it, there's like concentric circles, sort of. There's like this, the way that I envisioned it. Maybe I was thinking of a certain kind of choral tone or a certain, who knows what. But then there's all these different realms of possibility, and all of which are interesting. And I actually enjoy that. And sometimes I purposely leave decisions up to conductors and to choirs in my music, because then when I show up to hear it, I don't know exactly what I'm going to get. And I like finding out like which path they chose, sort of that kind of thing. There is, of course, a certain boundary beyond which, like, okay, now you're not just interpreting, you're just kind of messing up. And, I don't necessarily enjoy that, or poor musicianship. I'd rather try to do better. But within the realm of people really taking it seriously and trying to do well, I like that. So it leaves me without words sometimes when people say, like, now, how do you want this sung? A lot of times I don't some pieces I have an opinion about, but others I'm open to a lot of different things. And if I hear you sing it, I could give some feedback on, if you're going to do this, then how about that? But it's a lot less like, I am the composer, what I have written, thou shalt do it my way,
Yeah.
And a lot more just openness to possibilities.
Thank you. I think what we're going to do now is, Mikey, you want to open this for a little bit of Q&A? If Dan, Tracy, and Tony are cool with doing a little Q&A, I think, I don't know if the children have any questions already out there.
Yeah, we actually do have a few questions in the chat. And we've got about 10 minutes left. So we'll try to get through as many of these as we can. First question comes from Adriana. And she says, can you comment on the power music has to revive history? Are there different pressures that arise when you're trying to combine music and history? And that's open to anyone.
Well, I guess that's a question for me. I'm not quite sure, Adriana, what you mean by reviving history. I think in a piece like Over Havet that's telling a story, that's telling a historical story, I think it's important that in the text process and in the music process that it be specific to the subject, but also be able to be universalizable, so that someone of different ancestry or someone who maybe is a recent immigrant can latch their experience onto the piece and therefore have that transformative experience. Otherwise it becomes, there's a separation, like this is a piece about Peter Mandius Nerland, period. It's not about me, it's not about my experience, it's not about every immigrant, it's about him. And so I think when I'm trying to write in that way, I write personally, and then I scrub the poem of personal detail. I think every poem is about me ultimately, but I want to back away enough so that it can echo with everyone's experience. And ideally, something that happened 100 years ago, or poetry from 100 years ago, or 500 years ago, can speak just as powerfully to us today as it did back then. I think history, we are the same people we always were. We have the same emotions, we have the same troubles, we have the same joys and the same sorrows. And so there's a lot of universalizability in art, which is why we keep coming back to it over and over again. I'm not sure if that's where your question was getting, but that's just sort of what it made me want to say.
Thanks, Tony. The next question comes from Jay Silver. He says, hi, Dan, Tracy, and Tony. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us. Jay's been fortunate enough to sing under Tracy's baton and has sung the words of both Tony and Dan. So he wants to thank you for that incredible experience. The question is for Dan. He's had the privilege to sing Jubilate and Luke's at Carnegie Hall. Those pieces are over 30 minutes. How do you create long pieces and continue to create these unique styles in each movement or piece?
I read the words of somebody who taught writing once, who said, if you get the urge to write a novel, take 2 aspirin, lie down in a dark room, and wait for the urge to pass. And I would apply that in music to the urge to write like major multi-movement sort of works. At the risk of sounding self-pitying, boy, they're the greatest joy and the greatest burden at the same time. And a lot of times just slogging through day to day, looking for ideas and trying to get everything to fit together. It's a challenge for sure. On the more encouraging side, the form of a major work in some ways is not any different than the form of a smaller work, in that the same principles of proportion, of continuity and unity, as opposed to variety and diversity, those are the same. The issues of motion and flow and keeping someone's attention and not wearing out your welcome with a certain idea, when to change, when to keep going, all those different parameters of time, they're just on a larger scale. The thing that makes it more challenging is that everything that I just said has to happen within each movement, but then on the macro level, it has to happen between movements as well. So that's the real challenge musically, is is making sure that each movement makes sense, but yet then somehow these movements come together. One of the hardest things is finding movements that feel similar enough to belong together in the same major work, yet different enough to feel like separate movements. It's so easy to go too far one direction or the other. I don't want my major works to feel like just 5 totally different things, like collaged together, glued together in this weird monstrosity of an animal, you know. But at the same time, they have to be different enough so that when the next movement starts, you don't say, "Oh, more of this. Give it up, Dan." You know, like. So there's a lot of just self-doubt, a lot of self-criticism, a lot of living with it for a while and then coming back to it to try to see how an audience member is going to respond. And that's just on the musical side. Of course, on the textual side, there's issues of trying to find things, texts that fit together and create a whole, yet speak from a variety of voices and all that kind of thing. So yeah, it's a beast, but the payoff of putting together something that large and hopefully writing it well enough such that people want to perform it, that's the biggest payoff, and that's what keeps me writing these stupid great big pieces. When they get performed, it's so worth it, and sooner or later the urge comes back and the dark room and the aspirin don't work anymore. And then I go write a new one.
Thank you so much for that. The next question comes from Michael Coppola, and it's directed to Tony. How did you break into becoming a poet and a lyricist and as a historian? What did your journey look like?
Well, I mean, my day job has always been as a teacher. I taught high school for 15 years, and then I taught, I've been at the university now for 13 years. I never considered myself a poet. I mean, I never took any poetry classes or anything, but I just got lucky. My best friend for 30 years has been the composer Eric Whitacre. I know him, I've known him since before he ever wrote any music. And after we had already known each other for about 10 years, his career had started to sort of gain some momentum. And he asked me to translate a piece of a brief poem into Latin. And as a classical scholar and medievalist, you know, I approached it as a scholarly activity, but also as a singer. I tried to make choices. There's lots of ways of translating into Latin and lots of choices I could make. I wanted to make the most singable choices. And so I guess that was my very first experience as a lyric poet. And then within a year after Luxurumque, which is what that piece became, he asked me to write Sleep, which is a sort of infamous story now. I'm sure you've heard it. And then also Leonardo Dreams of His Flying Machine. So those 3 pieces came in rapid succession in 2000, 2001. And they became part of a successful part of his repertoire right at the beginning of the sort of liftoff of his career. And other composers noticed, and they began contacting me. And so it's just this weird serendipity that I don't consider myself a poet, and yet I have 20 years worth of an oeuvre with 75 different composers and hundreds of works that I've written, just because I said yes to a friend who wanted to collaborate on a piece. And so the lesson there is when you have an opportunity presented to you for some sort of creative adventure, say yes. You never know the kind of mountaintops that you're going to experience over the course of, you know, singing Dan's music in the Salzburg Cathedral. You know, that's one of those mountaintop experiences I won't ever forget. And had I said, no, Eric, you know, I'm really not interested in writing for you at 20 years ago, then this may not have ever happened. So that's the long answer to your short question.
We do have a few more questions in the chat, and I know that we've got some limited time left. So let's just get right through them. To everyone, what ways have you been staying positive in these crazy times?
For me, it's sitting on a very large John Deere tractor, tilling and disking fields out south of Lawrence. Believe it or not.
For me, it's gardening out back. I've been putting in ridiculous amounts of stone wall and trees and shrubs and pathways and edging, and I kind of call it our COVID garden.
And I've been practicing my instrument. I play Irish concertina, and I'm finally taking lessons and sort of taking my playing to the next level. But as a teacher, I don't have a lot of free time to think about it. So I've been grading papers and hand holding students on Zoom for the last 63 days.
Sure are. The next question is for Dan. What is your favorite movement of Luke's?
Favorite movement questions are always a little tough for me because it's like, what's your favorite child in this family? You know, I really conceive of all of those as working together. I think of the macro more than the individual movements. So they all have their place, and I'd like to think that none of them could really function without the others. However, if Voce's 8 is the one singing the middle movement, the sun never says, then that's a win.
There you go. This question is for Tony, comes from Tim Del Giorno. Tim writes a lot of wordy poems and struggles to set them to music. Beyond just making them shorter, what advice would you give to have a poem more settable?
Well, in the interest of time, I'm involved in Eric Whitaker's virtual choir number 6, which is going on right now. And as part of that, I've been giving some think tank videos, and there's one that's going to launch on the virtual choir on Eric's YouTube channel in the next day or two, and it's specifically about what I do when I'm writing a poem to make it a lyric poem, to make it a singable poem. And so just so we can get to the other questions, I'll say, please tune in or contact me separately. I've got some things on my social media presence and my website too that talks about my process as a lyric poet. But there are intentional things that you need to do if you're writing a poem that's going to be set by a composer or that's going to be sung either by a soloist or especially by a choir. That if you're mindful of those things while you're writing the poem, then the poem will be much more settable.
Thank you. And the last questions in the chat come from one of our alum, Brian Graff. And I think these are more towards Dan. When asked by someone to commission a piece for them, has there ever been a time where you felt you were not the right person to commission that specific piece? Or did you try to recommend someone else or take on the challenge anyway?
Yeah, I've had commission requests where it felt like the music, the text just did not sing to me. It's a weird thing to say. It sounds sort of metaphysical or something, but I have to hear music in a text. And it's not that I instantly know exactly what notes I'm going to set, but there's a musical quality to texts that are going to work for me that not immediately necessarily, but within a few days at least, normally I can tell, like, I hear music in this poem. And then there are others that are just beautiful poetry, but I would just as soon leave them alone, and I don't necessarily hear them singing. And then I have had times when I said no to a text like that because I just didn't hear music in it. And other composers have gone and set that text to music so beautifully. And then I've gone and just my hat's off to their work because they heard music in the text that I didn't. So it's not objective. It's very personal, and a text just has to resonate. There has to be music in it for you. And sometimes you're just not the right person. So I think that's healthy to be able to say, I don't think that's me, or I don't think I can right now. Yeah.
And then he asks, finale or Sibelius? Not for an endorsement, because this is being recorded. Do you use?
I use finale. I tried to switch to Sibelius because I'm a Mac guy, and Sibelius in a lot of ways is just a lot more Mac-ish. But I'm so used to finale and efficient in it that I couldn't be as efficient as my commission schedule demands of me. And I was spending too much time just trying to relearn how to do things. So I just went back to finale and have stuck with it ever since. I do think the two are so similar these days that it's not so big a deal anymore like it used to be.
And then a question that I'm going to pose to everybody before I toss it back to Sarah. The part of the glory of choral music is the togetherness, the ability to stand shoulder to shoulder with someone, to listen to them, to to listen in on what they're doing and feel in synchronicity with them. And in these strange times, we lose that. What kind of advice or what kind of charge can you give choirs to keep the energy, to keep the faith alive, and excited for when we can finally meet up again together?
Wow. Tracy, what do you think about that?
You know, it's a struggle. It's a struggle. I miss hearing. You know, there's a text in Joseph Martin's Awakening that talks about what if there was no choir to sing to change the world. And even though we have this electronic thing, it's not the same thing. And I thought a lot about that. Like, does this change everything? And how long is it going to be? But I guess at the end of the day, we all know it's going to happen. We all know we're going to come together and sing, and we have to stay focused on that instead of are we going to? Because we are going to. Choirs are going to sing again, and it's going to be much more meaningful than it has been, I would think, because they've learned what it's like not to have the experience of being together in a physical way. So it's the hope and the looking forward, not getting caught up in worrying that it's not, and waiting for that day to happen because it's going to be glorious.
I've been following social media, and most of my Facebook friends are choir directors or singers, and people had this initial, it's all the stages of grief, basically. We had the initial freak out, and then the negotiation, and the all the different stages. And now what people are talking about is this, exactly as Tracy says, this is going to happen, and it is going to look different for a while, but then we will be back. And so there's hope that we will sing together again soon. And a lot of that depends on our colleagues in the science departments who are going to be working on a vaccine for all of us. And so our job is to keep people's spirits up while we're all locked down, so that the people who are going to give us the vaccine or help us if we get sick are all, they've got good spirits. But I think there's so much listening that we can do. There's so much talking and reflecting about music and the role of music and the power of music that we often don't take time to do that. And so I think maybe the whole choral world can just pause and think and listen and talk and reflect, so that when we do come back and sing, it will be with a deeper understanding and appreciation of why this is so important and how much we've desperately missed being together. There's small ensemble repertoire that almost never gets done. There's Monteverdi madrigals and chant and some beautiful things that can be done in the ways in which we are allowed to sing together for the foreseeable future. And so I would encourage folks to do that as well. But yeah, hold on to that hope, that when we do sing together, it's going to be so glorious.
Yeah, I totally resonate and affirm with what both these guys are saying. We're all on the same boat and on the same wavelength with that. I'll just tack on at the end here. I learned a long time ago that sometimes we use people for the sake of music, and sometimes we use music for the sake of people. There are times when we say, all right, all you singers, it's time to work really hard and fight past difficulty and struggle and do all this difficult thing, because this music is going to be worth it. So like we give of ourselves and sacrifice ourselves even in a certain way for the sake of, like, this music is going to be great when we create it. But you can certainly turn the tables and look at it the opposite way, that the music is there for the sake of the people, and that we aren't just using people to get a good musical product, but that just as much in any situation, and in some situations even more, we're using the music for the sake of people. And it's not about how good can this music be, but how much can we help people through this music. And I think during this pandemic time, the scales are wildly tipped in the opposite direction, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, not singing is a terrible thing, and this pandemic is a stupid, crappy, horrible thing. But the sense that we right now can't like tell all our singers to get in line and do this stuff for the sake of music is actually good for us, because it makes us realize what the music is really there for. It's for people, and the people are still there. And there are ways, thankfully, with technology. I mean, the virtual choir thing, you know, we're all kind of toying with it and trying things and doing stuff. Some of them are cool. It's not singing together, and we all recognize that and feel it. But even to the extent that we can just share a recording with someone, or get together in a very small group and just make music with two of us, or within, you know, just a couple roommates, or within my family. Or I've gotten, for my church, I've gotten to help produce our worship broadcasts the last, 9-10 weeks in a row now. And they've been some of my favorite times in situations where normally it wouldn't have been a big deal for me. But it's because we're doing it for people. And so just the opportunity to see people and be reminded what the most important thing really is, I think is actually good for us. And when we come back to singing, we will value the music all the more, but maybe we'll also value the people all the more.
That's incredibly insightful. Thank you. Sarah, take it away.
I'm just so incredibly grateful, and your words are like a balm, I think, to so many of us. Yeah, we're all kind of scared, but yeah, I just really want to say thanks. Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Tracy. Thanks, Dan. You've really given us such blessings here today. This was so gracious of you, and so like wonderful. As far as I'm concerned, I'm more blessed than I was an hour and a half ago. I think that my takeaway from this is definitely leaning into the fact that we do these things to be part of something greater than ourselves, and where we all say those words, I think now we actually we understand them. And I think that realizing that this is a gift, that choral music is a gift, and everybody has a gift to give. You know, Tony, it's the words. Tracy, it's the pure drive of, yes, of course I'm going to sing in Ellis Island. And then Dan, the spinning of phrases that help us through these times. But then to each and every single student, you guys are just as important. This is a team This is a team activity. No one sits bench in singers, even if I think you should at times. But I think that we know that even though the team isn't physically together, we're mentally really connected. We're so very connected right now. And I think that's beautiful. And I'm just blessed by all of that. I don't have anything more to say other than, geez, thanks. And I would love to do this, every semester. It would be great. So that's really all I have to say. Thanks.
I think Tony is eager for more Zoom meetings.
Just give me a couple of days. Is all
I feel like I'm
new eyeglass prescription.
Slowly going blind. And actually, I was talking to Mike, my husband, about that, who's also on this call. Is that I came upstairs because all of my students know that I teach in my basement, which is dark and cold. Because there are 5 of us here virtually learning in 5 different rooms. And so it's cold and dark down there. And I come upstairs to do the really important Zooms, right? Not that, Dylan, you weren't important, or any of you were, you were all very important. But I come upstairs, and because it's so dark down there, I'm blind by light. And I said, how do you look at these monitors all day long? I'm like a mole now. I can't see anything. And part of it is that Mike very much spends time looking at slides or PowerPoint. It's not always this face-to-face interaction, really trying to connect through these monitors. So I think that's been my biggest frustration. But at the same time, at the end of this semester, I look back at all of the projects that were successful, and I'm like, hit it out of the park. Yeah, I love my basement now. Actually, I don't, Mike. I don't want to live in the basement. So that's all I have. Sorry.
Well, with all of that, it is now 5:30 out here in the East. I do want to thank you all for your time. Thank you for joining us today. If we can do this again in person, I feel like it would be even better. But as for now, this is where we say goodbye, and we hope to see you and talk with you all very soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Glad to see you.